Hello and welcome back to Simple Time Studios, where I share adventures and solo roleplay. Today we are continuing our solo campaign with the RPG Astroprisma by Crescent Chimera. Enjoy part 4 of Titanium Joe's adventures. Alright, picking up right where we left off. Joe takes off and heads to the ISF terraforming station in Hex 13 and has 12 fuel left. He turns in the quest and gets 110 serum, bringing him up to around 420, and gains +1 favor with the ISF. He is now high enough to join the ISF. Alright, as the Crimson Rose arrives back at the terraforming station, Joe exhaled and radioed a request to dock with the station. It felt good to have finally completed a job and get paid. He still needed to figure out where that WARG General was hiding, but then again, if the Corsairs knew where that target was, they wouldn't have asked Joe to look for them. In the meantime, it felt good to have accomplished something. Walking back to Dr. Pine's office, Joe sat down with the ISF scientists and shared the results of his errand. Descriptions of the seeds and how they reacted after being planted, locations of the planets he planted them on, and the directional locations so the scientists can find exactly where on a given planet he left a seed. Dr. Pine excitedly copied down all of Joe's information and handed the other man his payment. Joe had barely pocketed the serum and walked out of the scientist's office before he heard a familiar voice calling to him. "Why, if it isn't Titanium Joe! Haven't seen you since that time I was having engine trouble," Captain Quinn called out to him. Joe looked up. "Titanium Joe? Please tell me you don't call me that when you talk about me," he replied, of all the silly names he could have been saddled with. "Yeah, I've been telling all my friends about you. The ISF Sentinels in particular want to meet with you, especially once they've heard that you've been helping us with our terraforming project. They should be here any time now," Quinn replied, gesturing to a window looking outside onto the empty void beyond. A second later, the IF Sentinels did arrive. A Tarask Titan-class ship approached the station, the ISF standard printed on its 4 large thrusters. Quinn smiled and looked at Joe as the latter just looked at the massive capital ship in disbelief. "You gonna keep them waiting?" he asked Joe. Joe launched the Crimson Rose and was soon radioed by the ISF capital ship, getting permission to land on its flight deck. 2 mechanics began to work on the Crimson Rose the moment Joe left the ship. Fuel was pumped in, and another began to inspect the ship's hull for damage. "Name's Ares. Welcome to the team." A dashing ISF Sentinel takes off his helmet and gives Joe a firm handshake. "I'll be relaying your missions from HQ from now on. Make sure to keep an eye on your quest log and I won't bother you too much." He winked and gave Joe a pat on the shoulder before leaving. Joe blinked. No wonder there wasn't any concern about his background. Ares looked like the floppish protagonist of an old anime sold to teenage girls. Joe had worked with more than a few people like that and knew from experience that most of the time people like Ares ended up being a good-looking corpse. Still, if they recruited Ares and trusted him with military equipment, they weren't going to refuse a reformed mob gunman trying to maintain a low profile and start a new life. Still, Joe felt like he was forgetting something. "Hey, wait! Don't have to sign something to formally enlist or something?" he called out, suddenly realizing he was by himself on the flight deck. A soft female voice cleared her throat and shoved an electronic tablet in his face before he could see the source. "Actually, we just need the name and contact information of your next of kin, any beneficiaries, including any charities you support. And lastly, we need you to sign here, here, and here," the official-sounding female voice explained, gesturing to each item on the tablet computer with a slender, gloved finger. Joe signed all the data boxes and handed the tablet back to the ISF bureaucrat. He raised an eyebrow and smiled slightly at the figure he was handing the tablet back to. Clad in a junior officer's uniform that looked perhaps a size too large for her, a short woman with jet black hair worn in a tight bun looked at his paperwork with an approving nod, then looked back at him with a quizzical look in her eyes. "What?" she asked. "Nothing. Just surprised to see someone look the part more than others," he replied, jerking his head in the general direction Ares disappeared to. "Ah, yes. Ares sometimes has that effect on people, but it does take all sorts to restore civilization. Though I imagine that's something you would be familiar with, Mr. Henderson," she responded with a knowing smile. For a brief instant, he considered debating that point, but decided against it. "Joe," he introduced politely. "Claudia," she replied, handing Joe a large box. "Here is your ISF trade license and standard issue ion carbine. Try not to lose the carbine. We haven't quite managed to mass produce them yet," she explained. Joe nodded and took the parcel back to his ship. Not exactly how he expected to finally pick a side, but on the other hand, he did finally pick one. Now to see where his journey took him next. That ISF settlement bastion was probably a good place to start. Arriving at Bastion in Hex 11, Joe has 18 fuel left. He docks and explores the station while his ship refuels. Despite its militant name, Bastion turned out to be a fairly busy trade hub once Joe arrived and docked. Taking an elevator up from the hangars to the settlement proper, Joe walked out into a heavily urbanized station that wrapped around the entire length of the interior. The gunslinger was reminded of the more congested cities he left behind ages ago. So many years spent in the Reno family's service, only for it all to be nothing in the end. Putting those thoughts out of his head, he started to walk through the settlement and see what he could purchase now that he had some cash to spend and excess equipment to sell. Using a combination of his natural ability to network and establish connections, as well as his new ISF trade license, he was able to sell the Goss SMG to a gunsmith, the Atlas Hands to a cyberdoc, and the Volt hack to a Medusa hacker that was trying too hard to pretend to be an ISF loyalist and wasn't fooling anyone. With the additional serum in his pocket, he strolled down a side street and found himself in front of an armor shop. Several dressed dummies wearing various armor suits stood behind a pane of synthetic diamond smart glass as LED displays woven into the windows advertised various specials. A suit of eagle shot armor in the window caught Joe's eye. Light ceramic chest plate, smart links built into the wrist cuffs, and a target assisting visor. Everything a gunslinger would want to boost their ability to deliver precise shots. He walked into the shop, and soon a suit of eagle shot armor tailored to his size was sent to the Crimson Rose. With his business on the station almost done, he brought up his personal computer and accessed the station's local data network for promising jobs. 5 minutes later, he had a contract to transport boxes of soil samples from NISA to a research station. Reading through the coordinates, he realized that he was transporting the samples to an ISF scientist on the station he previously encountered the Synth Arch. Surely that had to be a typo, but after double-checking, he learned it was not. Well, that was a mystery he would solve when he got there. Leaving the station and heading towards the research outpost, he travels through Hex 3 and encounters a complication. I roll a 6, so a strange burning smell takes him to his cargo hold where a void crawler is biting into copper wires. Time to roll for initiative. Joe rolls a 13 on his. The void crawler gets a 7. Joe strikes first with his ion carbine. And rolls a 6, so the void crawler has 14 HP left. The void crawler rolls a 2 for his actions on fuel secretion. On the trip over, almost to destination, Joe was brought into the cargo hold by a strange burning smell. Fearing a fire in the cargo hold, he ran in with a fire extinguisher and came face to face with a large centipede-like creature. A void crawler, a common bane of starship travelers that teleport inside ships to make a mess of the inner world. Grabbing his ion carbine, Joe fired a short burst into the creature before his opponent had time to react. Taking several rounds to the chest, the alien insectoid replied by spraying Joe in the face with a stream of foul-smelling fuel-like fluid. Despite messing up the gunfighter's aim, Joe still landed another hit on the Void Crawler. Okay, now for their next turn. Void Crawler rolls a 10, so he's trying to teleport. He rolls a 1, so he does not get away. Joe fires again, doing 13 damage with his ion carbine and splattering the creature. I get 1 XP and to roll for loot, and I get a 2 on my loot result. Joe finds a health pack somewhere in the Void Crawler's gullet. How did it get there? And I realized I did this entire encounter without adding the bonus from the Eagle Shot armor to the mix. Okay, lesson learned. Taking multiple rounds, the Void Crawler decided to find another ship that hopefully did not have such a heavily armed owner. It began to vibrate and briefly appear out of phase with the rest of reality before phasing back in. Not wanting to give it the chance to escape again, Joe fired another burst and sawed the creature in half with his ion carbine. As the two disgusting halves of the creature flopped down on the deck floor, a medical kit slid out of the Void Crawler's innards. Joe examined the med pack, found nothing wrong with it, which made no sense, then cleaned the gunk off it and put it with the rest of his equipment. At least this delivery would go without a further hitch. Okay, moving on to Hex 4. Joe delivers the cargo and discovers the Synth-Arch medical facility seemingly disappeared. He collects his payment and is now at 3 favor with the ISF, 4 XP, and has an Apollo cockpit in the cargo hold to modify his ship with. Time to figure out where to go next. Arriving back at Hex 4, Joe checked the address on his delivery and ran a scan again just to be sure. Sure enough, the address took him straight to the research facility where he encountered the Synth-Arch. Radioing the station and docking, he was surprised to be greeted by an officious-looking ISF clerk eager to oversee the unloading of his cargo. "Is there a problem?" the small, tweedy man asked. "What? No, just... Didn't this station belong to someone else previously?" Joe replied, rubbing the back of his head in confusion. Surely this was the same station. The ISF clerk looked at him with a raised eyebrow. Joe decided to stop pressing the issue and sign off on the paperwork so he could get his cargo unloaded and get paid. A few minutes later, it was over. The containers were unloaded and his payment was loaded back onto his ship. He took off and headed back towards Bastion. Maybe there he would see if there was another contract he could take to get ahead now that he had his footing now. Okay. Joe returns to the ISF settlement of Bastion and refuels while he looks for work. Okay. Returning to Bastion, Joe skimmed the settlement's data sphere while he waited for the Crimson Rose to finish refueling. There was a good one that hopefully promised to be fairly simple for the amount it was worth. Someone needed someone to deliver a recently repaired satellite to Hex Grid 23 and launch it into orbit at its delivery location. Seeing an easy contract that let him get out and explore more of the solar system, he accepted and soon took off from Bastion. As he arrived in Hex 10, halfway to Hex 23, a mysterious ticking sound from the cargo bay got him to climb out of his chair and down to inspect the satellite in its container. The ticking sound had only grown louder and seemed to be coming from inside the cargo container. Taking a deep breath, he opened the container and quickly scanned the contents to see if he could spot anything that was out of place. The contraption that seemed to consist of an ancient analog clock hooked up to a wad of explosives by a mess of wires definitely looked like it fit the bill. Taking it out of the cargo container, he managed to rip the wires off the explosives before the clock finished counting down to 10 seconds. Closer than he would have liked to cut it, but any job you could walk away from. Separating the components, he crated the satellite back up and decided the mystery of who planted that explosive device could wait for another day. Right now, he had a delivery to make. Arriving at his destination without any further mishaps, Joe quickly launched the satellite and exhaled as it started to fall into a stable orbit. A few seconds later, he received a notification that the ISF was receiving a stable transmission from the satellite and wired his payment to his account. He was now 200 serum richer. Now that that was over with, it was time to see what else was in this system. Finally free, he starts to explore the Hex. On a 5 and a 5, he encounters Hypnos, a giant planet. It's Sylvanian, so it's a jungle planet like we thought Venus was in the old pulp novels. The only place he can land is on an interlocking formation of tree branches roughly 100 meters above the ground. Landing, he disembarks from his ship and starts to explore. I roll a 3 on the event table, so I get hostile chlorophyll. I roll vigor to escape, and my 8 does not beat the 10 on the challenge die. I'm going to spend a hyperdrive charge to re-roll, and I get even worse. 5 does not beat 10. Okay, yeah, he is going to retreat back to Bastion after this. Performing a quick sensor sweep, he quickly found the only stellar object of note was a giant Sylvanian planet named Hypnos. Bright, lush greens covered the entire sphere as he lazily orbited the planet and looked for a place to land. Atmosphere looked breathable no matter where he landed, so he had that going for him at least. The only place he could hope to land was a bizarre interlocking formation of tree branches roughly 100 meters above the planet's surface. If he didn't see it for himself, he would have sworn the formation was artificial in some way. 4 or 5 separate trees the size of skyscrapers growing together and fusing their branches together to make a more or less flat place big enough for the Crimson Rose to land and take off from. Trying to climb his way down, foliage cutting machete in hand, Joe thought he had almost made his way down to the ground when a vine shot out, wrapped around his ankle, and started dragging him into the underbrush. Flipping him upside down and hoisting him into the air, Joe found himself mere centimeters from the salivating jaws of a 3-headed carnivorous plant. At least it's not a 3-headed monkey, Joe sighed and started to swing at the vine, restraining him with a machete. Try as he might, though, he couldn't cut the vine fast enough. 3 plant jaws bit into him all at once, drawing blood and forcing him to switch tactics. If he couldn't cut himself free and run, he'd destroy the threat. Drawing his ion carbine and pulling the trigger, he vaporized the carnivorous plant in a burst of highly energized particles. Yet the creature still had the last laugh, showering him in acidic plant matter that burned almost as much as the initial bite. Free, he slowly staggered his way back to his ship. His muscles ached and burned as whatever poison the plant had coursed through his veins. He needed to head back to a settlement to see about getting an anti-venom. A good one. That was enough exploring hostile alien jungles for one day. Okay, returning to Bastion and docking, he's fully refueled and fully healed again. And after installing that Apollo cockpit, spending all of his XP in the process, and finally attaching that laser accelerator to his ion carbine, he then heads off. Returning to Bastion, his clothes ripped and covered in plant goo, Joe saw about getting his ship refueled and his wounds seen to. Even a short jump away, that plant venom still hurt like a mad mother. One short trip to the clinic later, though, it was all taken care of. While still sore, he was enough of his old self that he finally took care of that ship modification to the Crimson Rose and finally attached the laser accelerator weapon mod to his ion carbine. Done, he returned to his ship and reviewed the system map. Time to go exploring. Without a particular destination in mind, he heads down to Hex 26. Okay, Hex 26. Joe has 19 fuel left. I roll 5 and then a 2. He encounters a planet with 2 moons. On a 4, it's another Aquarian planet, 4 moons. I get a 2 for the crater moon I was looking for, and a 1 for an asteroid that got trapped in the planet's gravity well. The planet's name is Palladinia, and the moons are Upsilon Node and Delta Isle, respectively. The crater moon of Upsilon Node is the location where the WARG Major General is hiding out. The General's stat block looks tough, but I think I can do it. I mean, why not? If I die, I just end the campaign early and reload the character into a new campaign when I want to try again. So Joe drops down onto Epsilon Node, breaks into the WARG Major General's command bunker. Arriving at Hex 26, Joe scanned the area. His eyes immediately went wide when the computer reported back what the Crimson Rose had found. Another oceanic Aquarian planet, Palladinia. But what was most interesting was its 2 moons, an asteroid that had gotten caught in the planet's gravity well, and a barren crater moon where an encrypted WARG frequency was broadcasting. He had almost forgotten about that bounty he had taken for the WARG Major General. What to do? Shrugging and grabbing his modded ion carbine, he decided to risk it. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. Discreetly landing on the planet, he stealthily made his way to an isolated command bunker built into the side of a lunar crater. Overriding the airlock security, he was inside the bunker, but not without the target realizing he was there. "Who are you? Do you think you can stop the revolution?" the Major General growled as he stood up and reached for his weapons. "The People's Revolution isn't going anywhere so long as it's being led by a bunch of washed-up liberal arts majors," Joe replied dryly. Time for the fight to begin. Okay, Joe gets an 8 on his grace roll. The WARG General gets a 4. Joe goes first, opening up with his ion carbine. Okay. Taking the initiative, Joe opened fire with his ion carbine, the weapon's modification allowing him to penetrate the Major General's dense body armor, which was good because otherwise this fight would have no chance of ending in Joe's favor. Crying out in pain, the General took a step back and raised up his arms. Menacing metal blades sprouted out of his forearms as he took a swing at Joe and drew a fair bit of blood, cutting through the gunslinger's body armor. A sharp sting ran through Joe's body. Yeah, that was unpleasant. And Joe does 15 damage to the WARG General, and the WARG General does 5 to Joe. Joe has 15 left. Joe hits again with his ion carbine. 9 on the damage roll. The General has 56 HP left. And Joe also uses a flash round as his side action. The General is now stunned for a number of turns equal to tech, so 1 turn. So back to Joe again. Yes, I am cheesing the WARG boss with a stun lock. His injuries throwing off his aim, Joe hit with much less damage than he was liking in this firefight. Reaching into his coat, he pulled out a small flash grenade and threw it at his opponent, blinding the other man and stunning him for a spell. Okay, back to Joe again. He hits again with an ion carbine blast. He does 6 damage, down to 50. He stuns again as a side action, so back to him, and I only have 1 of those flash rounds left. Seeing his opening, Joe attacked again and used another of his flash grenades. Maybe if he piled it on, he might still survive this. This target was turning into much more of a challenge than he expected. Okay, Joe hits again a 4th time for 11. The WARG General is down to 39. Joe uses his last flash round and hit back to him 1 last time. Struggling to maintain his momentum, he attacked again and used his last stunning flash grenade. That opening attack drew too much blood. Okay, Joe hits again for 6 points of damage, 33 left for the General. The General strikes back. 8. The General casts a hack Ignite on Joe, doing 10 points of damage and overheating Joe for 2 turns. Joe has 5 HP left. Joe attacked one more time before the general cleared his eyes and retaliated. His eyes continuing to glow, the WARG General hit Joe with a burst of intense heat, setting the gunslinger ablaze. "Not bad for a washed-up liberal arts major, eh?" The WARG commander cackled. Joe starts his turn, taking 6 points of damage from overheat. He's dead. A charged corpse on the floor of the WARG General's Major General's bunker. Or is he dead? Try as he might, Joe could not put himself out before he blacked out from the pain. As he slipped into unconsciousness, he heard her voice. "Don't give up, Doug. It's not time yet." The end. Question mark? Final thoughts. Well, this was a longer project than I originally expected and took a number of turns I did not see coming, especially the ending. I originally thought Joe was going to go all the way to the end and liberate the Serenity system from the Corsair Syndicate for the ISF, then fight the last of the Reno family in a bonus credit scene. It was also a bit of a slow start, but I think that was mostly because of my dice rolls. I'm not sure if that impacted my character's progression, and I was underleveled towards the middle when Joe finally joined the ISF. This is also the first time I've ever had a character die in solo play, so I actually sat on it for a couple days debating whether I wanted to rewind back to before things went downhill for the character, or take the hit on the chin and chalk it all up as a learning experience. Overall, it was a pretty good game, but I think I made the right decision to not use any of the additional content for this run, as this was already running much longer than I expected, and was originally going to turn into one of my longest recorded campaigns to date. As for how I feel about Astroprisma now that I've played a game, it's not a bad game. It's swingy at points, or that might just have been my dice, and can get a bit long in the tooth depending on the choices you make, but it's not a bad game. Combat was where the dice was at their most random, and while it was thrilling, there was also moments where the NPC's tactics didn't make the most sense, such as during my starship encounter. There were also a few spots here and there that could have used more clarification, that wasn't in my version of the rules, or were an error in translation. I might give this game another run sometime in the future once I've gone through a few other solo campaigns on my list first. As for Joe, there are a couple ways I can come back to him. I can do the obvious "that never happened" thing, or I can take something the game calls an abyssal scar. Or I can just create an entirely new character that has to go look for Joe. We'll see what happens. Regardless, this was definitely fun, and I'd still recommend the Creator Crescent Chimera. Until next time, adventurers. End of recording.